The emergency beacon cut through the static of deep space like a knife through silence. Ambassador Kell of the Tari people had never imagined he would be the one to send the final message from his homeworld. But here he was, fingers trembling, over the communication array as explosions rocked the underground bunker around him. "This is Ambassador Kell of the Tari colony on Refuge Prime," he spoke into the transmitter, his voice barely steady. "We are under attack by Krek slavers. Our defenses have fallen. They are taking our people. Please, anyone who receives this message, we need help. We have perhaps 2 days before our entire population is loaded onto their ships." The message traveled through subspace, reaching listening posts across the galaxy. Most species that received it simply archived the transmission and moved on. The Krek Empire was too powerful, too ruthless. Getting involved would only invite their attention to your own worlds. Better to stay quiet and hope they looked elsewhere. The Galactic Council chambers on Nexus Station buzzed with nervous energy as representatives from dozens of species gathered for an emergency session. The holographic display showed the last known position of Refuge Prime, now surrounded by red warning markers indicating Krek fleet movements. "The Tari are a peaceful species," said Counselor Yellen, her forearms gesturing toward the tactical display. "They have no weapons, no military. They are farmers and artists. The Krek will harvest them like crops." "And what exactly do you propose we do about it?" snapped Representative Gorix, his scales shifting to an agitated purple color. "The Krek have 200 ships in that system. Our combined fleets number less than 50 vessels in that sector." The chamber fell silent. Everyone knew the math. The Krek Empire had grown too strong over the past century, feeding on the populations of weaker species. They had perfected the art of slavery, turning sentient beings into commodities to be traded across the galaxy. The peaceful species that made up the majority of the Galactic Council had no answer for such organized brutality. "There is one option," Yellen said quietly, her voice causing a ripple of unease through the chamber. "We could contact the humans." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Delegates began speaking over each other, their various forms of communication creating a cacophony of chirps, clicks, and warbles. Representative Morvac slammed his crystalline appendage on his speaking podium, the sound echoing through the chamber. "The humans are quarantined for a reason," he declared. "They come from a death world. Everything on their planet evolved to kill. They are violent, unpredictable, and dangerous. We isolated them to protect ourselves. And yet," Yellen continued, "they have never attacked a peaceful species. Every report we have shows them to be protective of innocent life. They fight each other constantly, yes, but they have never harmed anyone who posed no threat." The debate raged for hours. Some delegates argued that involving humans would be like inviting a plague into the galaxy. Others pointed out that the Krek were already a plague and perhaps it took monsters to fight monsters. The Tari had been respected members of the galactic community for over 3 centuries. They had contributed art, philosophy, and agricultural innovations that had benefited countless worlds. Finally, as reports came in of more Tari colonies going silent, the vote was called. By the narrowest of margins, the Council authorized contact with the human government. The message would be simple: humanitarian crisis. Peaceful species under attack. Assistance requested. The transmission was sent through the quantum relay network toward the Sol system, traveling across the galaxy at faster-than-light speeds. It carried with it the desperate hope of a dying species and the fears of an entire galactic civilization. The response came faster than anyone had expected. Within hours, a human vessel appeared at the edge of the Nexus Station system. The ship was sleek and dark, its hull absorbing sensor scans in a way that made it difficult to get accurate readings. It had arrived without any of the usual fanfare that accompanied diplomatic visits. "Nexus Station, this is the Terran vessel Tenacious Spirit," came the transmission. "We received your message regarding the humanitarian crisis. We are already en route to Refuge Prime. Estimated arrival time is 72 hours. The council chamber erupted in surprised murmurs. The humans had not asked for details. had not requested permission to enter the system, had not even acknowledged the political implications of their involvement. They had simply stated their intention to help and begun moving toward the crisis. Already en route? Yellen whispered to her aide. How could they already be moving? We just sent the message. What the council did not know was that the humans had been monitoring Krek movements for months. They had watched the slave raids, tracked the fleet movements, and identified the most likely targets. When the distress call came from Refuge Prime, human forces were already positioned to respond. The tenacious spirit maintained communication silence as it departed the system, leaving the council to wonder what they had just unleashed. Some delegates celebrated, believing they had found a solution to the Krek problem. Others worried that they had simply traded one threat for another dot in the depths of space. The human ship accelerated toward Refuge Prime, its crew preparing for what they knew would be a rescue operation unlike any they had attempted before. The humans had studied the Krek, had learned their tactics, and had prepared for this moment. They knew that the galaxy saw them as monsters, as the violent offspring of a world too dangerous for civilized life. What the galaxy did not understand was that being forged in the crucible of a Deathworld had created something unique, a species that was not only capable of incredible violence, but one that chose to use that capability to protect those who could not protect themselves. The distress call from Refuge Prime had not just summoned help. It had summoned the full force of Deathworlders, and they were coming with everything they had. The countdown to humanity's first major intervention in galactic affairs had begun, and nothing would ever be the same. The Krek fleet hung in space around Refuge Prime like a swarm of metallic insects, their ships designed for intimidation as much as function. Admiral Vecnor observed the planet below from his command vessel, watching as the final pockets of Tari resistance were being eliminated. The processing centers on the surface were already filling with captured civilians, sorted by age and species compatibility for the slave markets. Status report, the Admiral commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had conquered dozens of worlds. Approximately 80% of the population has been secured, reported his tactical officer. The remaining settlements are being processed now. We estimate full harvest completion within 36 hours. Vecnor nodded with satisfaction. The Tari had put up less resistance than expected. Their peaceful nature made them easy prey, and their agricultural skills would make them valuable commodities in the Outer Rim markets. This would be another profitable venture for the Empire. The first sign of trouble came from the outer sensor grid. A single contact had appeared at the edge of the system, moving at high speed toward the planet. The sensor operator frowned at his display, running the signature through the ship's database. Admiral, we have an unknown vessel approaching. Configuration does not match any known species in our database. Probably a council ship, Vecnor dismissed. They always send someone to file a formal protest after we finish our work. Let them come. They can watch from a safe distance. But the single ship did not maintain a safe distance. It continued its approach, and as it drew closer, more contacts began appearing throughout the system. First 1, then 5, then 20. The Krek sensors were suddenly tracking hundreds of vessels, all moving with coordinated precision toward the planet. Admiral, we are reading massive fleet movements, the tactical officer reported, his voice tense. Multiple formations, unknown configuration. They are not responding to our hails. Vecnor moved to the tactical display, his confidence wavering for the first time. The approaching ships were unlike anything in the Krek database. They moved with a fluid grace that suggested advanced propulsion systems and their formation. Patterns showed a level of coordination that spoke of extensive training. What species sends this many ships without announcing themselves? He muttered. The answer came in the form of a tight beam transmission that somehow bypassed all of their communication security. The voice that spoke was calm, measured, and carried an undertone of barely controlled fury. Krek vessels, this is Commander Rivers of the United Earthship Indomitable. You are hereby ordered to cease all hostile activities and release your prisoners immediately. You have 10 minutes to comply before we begin operations. The bridge of the Krek command ship fell silent. Earth, the quarantined Deathworld that the galaxy feared to contact. The species that had been isolated because they were too dangerous for civilized space. Humans, Vecnor whispered, then raised his voice. All vessels, combat formations. Prepare for battle. These Deathworlders think they can intimidate us with their numbers. The human fleet spread out around the Krek formation with a precision that was almost mechanical. They did not engage in the usual posturing that preceded most space battles. There were no demands for surrender, no attempts at negotiation. They simply began their work. The first wave of human fighters swept through the Krek formation like a scythe through wheat. Their ships were smaller than the Krek vessels, but moved with an agility that seemed to defy physics. They targeted specific systems with surgical precision, crippling weapons arrays and propulsion systems while leaving life support intact. They are not trying to destroy us, the tactical officer observed with growing alarm. They are disabling our ships. Vecnor watched in horror as his fleet was systematically neutralized. The humans fought with a cold efficiency that was more terrifying than any battle rage. They moved as if this entire engagement had been planned and rehearsed countless times. Every maneuver was calculated, every shot precisely placed. The Krek had studied warfare for centuries, but they had never encountered an enemy like this. These were not the humans of the historical databases, fighting primitive wars on their homeworld. These were the humans who had united under a single banner, who had turned their capacity for violence into a tool for protecting the innocent. "Sir, the humans are launching boarding pods," reported the weapons officer. "They are targeting our slave transports." "Impossible," Vecnor snarled. "Those ships are in the middle of our formation. They would have to fight through our entire fleet to reach them." But the humans had already done exactly that. Their assault ships moved through the Krek formation with contemptuous ease, their weapons carving paths through the enemy ranks. The boarding pods that launched from these ships were unlike anything the Krek had encountered. They moved with their own propulsion systems, equipped with shields that deflected the desperate defensive fire. On the planet below, the human ground forces were already landing. They had somehow bypassed the orbital defenses and were deploying troops directly to the processing centers. The Krek ground commanders found themselves facing an enemy that moved with inhuman speed and coordination. Commander Rivers watched the tactical display from the bridge of the Indomitable, her expression grim. The human fleet had been preparing for this moment for years, studying Krek tactics and developing countermeasures. They had trained for urban combat, for ship-to-ship fighting, for the specific challenges of rescuing civilians from hostile forces. "All units, remember your priorities," she announced over the fleet communication system. "Every civilian down there is someone's family. We do not leave until every single one is safe." The Krek had expected to face another galactic fleet with predictable tactics and conventional weapons. Instead, they found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to anticipate their every move. The humans had turned warfare into a science, and they had brought the full weight of that science to bear on the slave empire. "Admiral," Vecnor felt his command ship shudder as human boarding pods attached to the hull. The bridge doors exploded. Inward and armored figures poured through the breach. The last thing he saw before the stun blast hit him was the cold, determined eyes of a human soldier. The battle for Refuge Prime was over before it had truly begun. The humans had not just defeated the Krek fleet. They had dismantled it with surgical precision, leaving the slavers helpless and their victims free. The Deathworlders had arrived, and they had brought with them the full force of their terrible, protective fury. The underground tunnels beneath Processing Center 7 had been carved by the Tari generations ago as part of their agricultural infrastructure. Now they served as the highway for human rescue teams to reach the thousands of civilians trapped in the facility above. Sergeant Alex Thompson moved through the darkness with practiced silence, his enhanced vision allowing him to navigate the narrow passages without alerting the guards stationed throughout the complex. "Contact ahead," whispered Private Rodriguez. Through the CUM system, 2 guards, standard patrol pattern. Thompson held up his hand, bringing the 12-person rescue team to a halt. The Krek guards were massive creatures, easily twice the size of an average human, with thick armored hide and natural weapons that could tear through steel. In any fair fight, they would have been formidable opponents. The humans did not fight. Fair? 2 silent shots from Thompson's weapon dropped the guards before they could raise an alarm. The team moved past the bodies without pause, their mission clock showing they had been underground for 23 minutes. Intelligence suggested they had perhaps an hour before the Krek realized the facility was being infiltrated. "Remember, people," Thompson said quietly, "we have 10,000 civilians up there. Every second we waste is another family that might not make it home." The team reached the maintenance shaft that led directly into the processing center's main holding area. Through the grating, they could see the horror that the Krek had created. Thousands of Tari civilians were packed into holding pens, sorted by age and physical condition. The youngest were kept separate, presumably for transport to markets that specialized in child slaves. Thompson felt the familiar cold rage settle in his chest. The humans had studied the Krek slave trade for years, learning every detail of their operations. They had seen the intelligence reports, the survivor testimonies, the evidence of what happened to the species that fell under Krek control. This was why they had trained, why they had prepared, why they had built their fleets and honed their skills. "Breaching in 3, 2, 1, he whispered. The grating exploded outward as shaped charges blew it from its frame. The human team poured through the opening like water through a burst dam, their weapons already tracking targets. The few Krek guards in the immediate area barely had time to register the threat before they were neutralized. The Tari civilians huddled in their pens, terrified by the sudden violence. They had never seen humans before, but they had heard the stories. The galaxy whispered about the Deathworlders, the violent species that had been quarantined for the safety of all. Now these monsters were in their prison, and they did not know if rescue or death had arrived. "Easy, easy," Thompson said, his voice gentle as he approached the nearest pen. "We are humans. We received your distress call. We are here to help." The contradiction was startling. This being, who had just killed 3 guards with casual efficiency, was now kneeling beside a group of terrified children, his voice soft and reassuring. His team was already working to unlock the pens, their movements quick but careful not to frighten the civilians further. "Can you walk?" Thompson asked an elderly Tari who was clearly injured. "We need to get you out of here." The old being nodded weakly, and Thompson carefully lifted him, supporting his weight as they moved toward the exit. Around them, the other team members were doing the same, each soldier responsible for guiding civilians to safety while maintaining security. The evacuation proceeded with mechanical precision. The humans had trained for exactly this scenario, practicing urban rescue operations until they could perform them in their sleep. Every movement was calculated to maximize civilian safety while minimizing exposure to enemy fire. "Thompson, we have movement on the upper levels," Rodriguez reported. "Looks like the Krek are finally figuring out what is happening." "Copy that," Thompson replied. "Pack it up, people. We have what we came for." But as they reached the tunnels, Thompson realized they had a problem. The elderly and injured Tari could not move fast enough through the narrow passages. The Krek would be flooding the tunnel soon, and there was no way to get all the civilians out in time. "Rodriguez, get these people to the extraction point," Thompson ordered. "I will hold the tunnel." "Sir, you cannot take on an entire Krek garrison alone." Thompson checked his weapon and smiled grimly. "Who said anything about alone?" As if summoned by his words, explosions began echoing through the facility above. The cavalry had arrived in the form of human assault teams hitting the processing center from multiple directions. The Krek guards found themselves fighting a battle on several fronts, their attention scattered between the various threats. Dr. Emma Foster had set up her field hospital in what had been the Tari capital's main square. The temporary medical facility was a marvel of human engineering, capable of treating dozens of patients simultaneously while maintaining sterile conditions. As the first groups of rescued civilians arrived, She coordinated treatment with the calm efficiency of someone who had prepared for this moment her entire career. Malnutrition, dehydration, psychological trauma, she reported to her medical team. Standard profile for slave camp survivors. Treat the physical symptoms first, then we can address the psychological impact. The Tari who were brought to her facility stared in wonder at their treatment. These humans, who the galaxy feared as monsters, were kneeling beside injured children and elderly civilians, administering medical care with gentle hands. They spoke in soft tones, offered comfort, and treated each patient as if they were family. "Why are you helping us?" asked a young Tari female who had been separated from her family during the raids. Foster looked up from the medical scanner she was using to check the girl's vital signs. "Because it is the right thing to do. Because no one should have to live in fear of being taken from their home. Because we are strong enough to stop this, so we must." The girl nodded, not fully understanding, but sensing the sincerity in the human's voice. Around them, the field hospital continued its work, treating the wounded and reuniting families. The humans had brought everything needed for a full-scale humanitarian operation, from medical supplies to portable shelters to emergency food distribution systems. By the end of the first day, over half of the Tari population had been freed from the processing centers. The Krek ground forces had been scattered and defeated, their command structure broken by the coordinated human assault. The ships that had brought the slavers to this world were either destroyed or captured, their crews facing a justice they had never expected to encounter. The rescue operation continued through the night, with human teams working around the clock to locate and extract every surviving civilian. They moved through the ruins of Tari cities, following leads and tracking down hidden groups of survivors. No one would be left behind. No family would be incomplete when the humans finally departed. The galaxy had asked for help, and the Deathworlders had delivered it with a thoroughness that surprised even their supporters. They had not just driven off the Krek, they had dismantled their entire operation and rescued every single person who could be saved. The humans had proven that their reputation for violence was matched only by their capacity for compassion. The escape pods scattered across the system like seeds in the wind, each one carrying Krek survivors desperate to reach safety. Admiral Vecnor watched from his damaged command ship as his once mighty fleet dissolved around him. The humans had not just defeated his forces. They had systematically hunted down every vessel that attempted to flee, capturing or destroying them with ruthless efficiency. "Status report on the evacuation ships," he demanded, his voice strained from the interrogation he had endured hours. Earlier, 17 vessels attempted to break orbit, his communications officer reported. "None have reached the jump point. The humans are tracking every ship that tries to leave the system." This was not how wars were supposed to be fought. In Krek culture, defeat meant retreat, regrouping, and planning for the next battle. The humans seemed to operate under different rules entirely. They pursued their enemies with the single-minded determination of predators who had identified a threat that needed to be eliminated completely. The human vessels moved through space with a grace that defied their size. Their ships were sleek and purposeful, designed for function rather than intimidation. They communicated in short, efficient bursts, coordinating their movements with the precision of a machine. Every action seemed to have been planned in advance, every contingency prepared for. "Sir, we are receiving a transmission from the human fleet," the communications officer announced. "Put it through," Vecnor ordered. Steeling himself for whatever ultimatum the Deathworlders would deliver, the voice that came through the speakers was calm and measured, carrying an undertone of controlled fury that made the Admiral's blood run cold. "This is Commander Rivers of the United Earthship Indomitable. Admiral Vecnor, you are hereby ordered to surrender your vessel and prepare for boarding. Any attempt to resist will result in the immediate destruction of your ship." If I refuse?" Vecnor asked, though he already knew the answer. "Then you will join the 14 other Krek vessels that chose to fight rather than surrender. Your choice, Admiral." The transmission ended, leaving the bridge in silence. Vecnor looked around at his crew, seeing the fear in their eyes. They had heard the stories about human interrogation techniques, about the way Deathworlders treated prisoners. The galaxy whispered about the humans' capacity for creative violence, their ability to extract information through methods that would horrify civilized species. "Admiral, the humans are launching boarding pods," the tactical officer reported. "They are not waiting for our response." The impact of the boarding pods echoed through the ship's hull like the beating of a giant heart. Vecnor drew his sidearm, knowing it would be useless against the humans but unable to face capture without some gesture of defiance. The bridge doors exploded inward, and armored figures poured through the breach. The human soldiers moved with inhuman speed and coordination, their weapons trained on specific targets with surgical precision. They wore full combat armor that made them look like mechanical demons, their faces hidden behind tactical visors that glowed with an eerie blue light. "Admiral Vecnor," one of the humans said, his voice amplified by his armor speakers. "I am Colonel Torres. You and your crew are now prisoners of the United Earth Forces. You will be treated according to the standards of the Geneva Convention and the Terran Military Code of Conduct." Vecnor had expected threats, torture, or immediate execution. Instead, he found himself being processed by soldiers who seemed more interested in gathering intelligence than inflicting punishment. The humans searched his vessel methodically, copying every database, recording every communication, and cataloging every piece of equipment. "What are you doing?" he demanded as he watched the humans work. "Learning," Torres replied simply. "Your empire has been operating in the shadows for too long. We are bringing everything into the light." The systematic nature of the human operation was more terrifying than any threat of violence. They were not just fighting a battle. They were conducting a comprehensive intelligence operation designed to map every aspect of the Krek Empire. Every ship they captured provided more data, more connections, more targets for future operations. In the depths of the captured flagship, human technicians worked around the clock to break the Krek encryption systems. Their computers processed terabytes of data, cross-referencing locations, analyzing communication patterns, and building a comprehensive picture of the slave trade network that stretched across the galaxy. "Sir, we have successfully penetrated their central database," reported technical specialist Kim, her fingers flying across her interface. "We have locations for 47 slave processing facilities, trade routes, client lists, and financial records going back 20 years. Torres nodded grimly. The humans had not come to Refuge Prime just to rescue the Tari. They had come to gather intelligence for a much larger operation. The distress call had provided them with the justification they needed to begin what they called the Liberation Protocol. "Upload everything to the fleet database," he ordered. "Command needs to see this immediately." Across the system, similar scenes were playing out on dozens of captured Krek vessels. The humans had turned the entire battle into a massive intelligence-gathering operation, using their superior technology and ruthless efficiency to extract every piece of information about the slave trade network. The few Krek ships that had managed to escape the immediate battle zone found themselves being hunted across the galaxy. Human vessels appeared at their destinations, having somehow anticipated their movements. The Deathworlders had studied their prey well, learning their patterns and predicting their behavior with unnerving accuracy. "They know everything," whispered Captain Velcour as his ship was boarded near the outer rim. "They know our routes, our contacts, our safe houses. How is this possible?" The answer came from the human officer who accepted his surrender. "We have been watching you for a long time, Captain. We know more about your empire than you do. The only question now is whether you want to be part of the solution or part of the problem." The Krek had built their civilization on the principle that might makes right. They had conquered the weak, enslaved the peaceful, and grown fat on the suffering of others. They had never encountered a species that could match their appetite for violence while simultaneously possessing the moral conviction to use that violence for protection rather than exploitation. Admiral Vecnor found himself in a holding cell aboard a human vessel, surrounded by other captured Krek officers. They had expected torture, execution, or slavery. Instead, they were being offered something unprecedented, the chance to testify against their own empire in exchange for amnesty and relocation. "Why would you offer us mercy?" he asked the human interrogator, a quiet woman who spoke with the authority of someone who had seen too much suffering. "Because we are not like you," she replied. "We do not seek vengeance. We seek justice. Your empire will fall, but your people do not have to die with it. Choose wisely, Admiral. This offer will not be repeated." The hunter had become the hunted, and the Krek Empire was learning what it meant to face an enemy that fought not for conquest, but for the protection of the innocent. The humans had brought their full force to bear on the slave trade, and they would not stop until every chain was broken and every slaver brought to justice. The data scrolled across the holographic display in the human command center like a digital waterfall, each line representing another piece of the vast puzzle that was the Krek slave trade network. Intelligence Officer Rachel Stone studied the information with the focused intensity of someone who had dedicated her career to understanding the enemies of humanity. What she was seeing exceeded their worst estimates. "The network is massive," she reported to the assembled fleet commanders. 47 processing centers, over 200 trading posts, and direct connections to the governments of 12 different species. The slave trade is not just tolerated in this galaxy, it is actively supported by major powers. Commander Rivers leaned forward, her expression grim. "How many people are we talking about? Conservative estimate? 15 million sentients currently in bondage. The actual number could be twice that." The silence in the command center was deafening. The humans had expected to find a criminal organization. Instead, they had uncovered a galactic institution that had been operating for centuries with the tacit approval of the very governments that claimed to champion peace and civilization. "Ma'am, we are receiving priority transmissions from Earth Command," reported Communications Officer Bryant. "They are requesting immediate upload of all intelligence data," Rivers nodded. "Send everything, full encryption. Command needs to see what we are dealing with out here." What Command saw when they reviewed the intelligence was confirmation of what human leaders had long suspected. The Galactic Council was not the peaceful organization it claimed to be. It was a collection of species that had grown comfortable with the suffering of others. As long as that suffering happened far from their own worlds, the response from Earth was swift and decisive. Operation Liberation Shield was authorized, and human fleets began moving toward every known slave facility in the galaxy. The rescue of the Tari had been just the beginning. The humans were preparing for the largest military operation in galactic history. The council chambers on Nexus Station buzzed with panicked energy as reports came in from across known space. Human fleets were appearing at slave facilities throughout the galaxy, systematically dismantling the network that had operated in the shadows for so long. The Deathworlders were not just fighting a war, they were reshaping the entire galactic order. "They are attacking sovereign territory," protested Representative Morvik, his crystalline form flickering with agitation. "Several of the facilities they have targeted are operating under legal permits from member governments." "Legal permits to enslave sentient beings?" asked Councillor Yellen, her voice carrying a tone of disgust. "Is that what we have become? Are we so corrupted that we issue licenses for atrocities?" The debate that followed was unlike anything in the Council's history. For the first time, member species were forced to confront the reality of what they had allowed to flourish in their territory. The humans had not just provided evidence of individual crimes. They had documented systematic complicity at the highest levels of galactic government. "The humans are demanding complete transparency," reported the Council's intelligence director. "They want access to all government databases, all trade records, all communication logs. They are threatening to treat any species that refuses as hostile." "They cannot make such demands," Morvik insisted. "They are a single species." "We are hundreds of civilizations working together. A single species that has just crippled the Krek Empire in less than a week," Yellen pointed out. A single species that has demonstrated the ability to project force anywhere in the galaxy. A single species that seems to have been preparing for this moment for decades. The truth was more complex than even Yellen realized. The humans had not just been preparing for decades. They had been preparing since their first contact with galactic civilization. They had learned about the slave trade, about the corruption, about the countless species that suffered while the civilized galaxy looked the other way. They had built their fleets, trained their soldiers, and developed their tactics specifically for this purpose. The war, if it could be called that, was over almost before it began. The Krek resistance collapsed within days as human forces systematically eliminated every aspect of their military infrastructure. The slavers who had terrorized the galaxy for centuries found themselves facing an enemy that seemed to know their every move before they made it. The last Krek stronghold has fallen, reported Colonel Torres from the bridge of his assault ship. We have documented evidence of over 3 million beings held in bondage across their territory. Liberation operations are proceeding on schedule, but the humans were not content with just defeating the Krek. They were methodically working through the intelligence they had gathered, targeting every species and organization that had supported the slave trade. Trading companies found their assets frozen. Government officials found themselves under investigation, and entire economic systems built on forced labor collapsed overnight. The galactic economy, which had grown dependent on cheap slave labor, began to crumble. Worlds that had prospered through the exploitation of others found themselves facing economic collapse. The humans, however, had prepared for this as well. The Terran Economic Stabilization Package, as it came to be known, was as comprehensive as the military operation that had preceded it. The humans offered technology, resources, and expertise to any species willing to abandon the slave trade and embrace legitimate commerce. They provided education, medical care, and infrastructure development to the worlds that had been devastated by the slavers. The Tari, who had been the catalyst for the entire operation, found themselves at the center of a new galactic alliance. The Terran Protection Alliance began as a mutual defense pact between humanity and the species they had liberated. It quickly grew into something much larger as other civilizations sought the protection that only the humans could provide. "We are not conquerors," Commander Rivers explained to the newly formed Alliance Council. "We are protectors. We will not rule you, but we will defend you. We will not control your governments, but we will ensure your freedom." The transformation of galactic civilization was not without its challenges. Several species attempted to resist the new order, preferring the old system where they could profit from the suffering of others. They found themselves facing the same fate as the Krek, their fleets scattered and their leadership brought to justice. The former Admiral Vecnor stood before the War Crimes Tribunal on Terra, facing charges that would have been unthinkable just months before. The humans had not executed him or subjected him to the torture he had expected. Instead, they had put him on trial, with full legal representation and due process. The defendant is charged with crimes against sentience, including the enslavement of peaceful populations, the murder of civilians, and the systematic destruction of cultural heritage, the human prosecutor stated. "How do you plead?" Vecnor looked around the courtroom, seeing representatives from dozens of species he had enslaved over the years. The humans had brought them all together, not for revenge, but for justice. It was a concept that the Krek had never understood, but one that the humans seemed to hold sacred. "Guilty," he said quietly. "I plead guilty to all charges." The galaxy that emerged from the collapse of the slave trade was fundamentally different from what had come before. The humans had not simply destroyed an institution. They had replaced it with something better. The former processing centers were converted into rehabilitation facilities, providing medical care and psychological support to the millions of beings who had been freed from bondage. The trade routes that had once carried slaves now carried relief supplies and reconstruction materials. The fleets that had enforced the will of the slavers were either destroyed or converted into search and rescue vessels. The final tally, reported Director Stone to the Alliance Council 6 months after the liberation began, is 18.7 million beings freed from slavery, 47 worlds liberated from Krek occupation, and the complete dismantling of the largest criminal organization in galactic history. The numbers were staggering, but they only told part of the story. The humans had not just broken the chains. They had helped rebuild entire civilizations that had been devastated by centuries of exploitation. They had provided technology, resources, and knowledge to species that had been kept deliberately primitive to make them easier to control. The Tari delegation stood before the Alliance Council, their representative speaking with a voice that carried the gratitude of an entire species. 6 months ago, we were facing extinction. Today, our children are learning in schools built by human engineers. Our sick are being treated in hospitals staffed by human doctors, and our artists are creating works that celebrate our freedom. The transformation was not limited to the former slave worlds. The entire galactic economy had been restructured around legitimate trade and voluntary cooperation. The humans had introduced concepts like worker protection, environmental conservation, and technological sharing that had been alien to most galactic civilizations. "We are stronger together," Commander Rivers addressed the assembled delegates. "Every species brings unique strengths, unique perspectives, unique solutions to the challenges we face. The old galaxy was built on the exploitation of the weak by the strong. The new galaxy will be built on the cooperation of equals." The former Krek territories had been redistributed among the species that had been enslaved there, with human supervision to ensure fair allocation of resources. The massive slave ships had been converted into colony vessels, carrying freed populations back to their homeworlds or to new settlements where they could rebuild their lives. Some of the Krek themselves had chosen to join the new order, renouncing their former ways and dedicating themselves to making amends for the crimes of their empire. They worked alongside their former victims, building schools and hospitals where slave markets had once operated. "Redemption is possible for anyone willing to seek it," the human chaplain explained to a group of former Krek soldiers who had volunteered for reconstruction duty. "Your past does not define your future. Your actions from this day forward will determine who you truly are." The galactic community watched in amazement as worlds that had been devastated by slavery began to flourish under human protection. Agricultural worlds that had been strip-mined for profit were restored to productivity. Industrial centers that had relied on forced labor were converted to automated systems that provided better working conditions for voluntary employees. The humans had brought more than military might to the galaxy. They had brought a different way of thinking about civilization itself. They believed that strength came from protecting the weak, that prosperity came from lifting everyone up together, and that true security came from justice rather than fear. "The age of predators is over," announced President Martinez of the United Earth Government in his address to the galaxy. "The age of protectors has begun. Any species anywhere in known space that faces extinction or enslavement need only call for help. We will answer." The promise was not an empty one. Human fleets maintained constant patrols throughout the galaxy, their sensors always scanning for signs of distress. They had established a network of early warning stations that could detect slave raids before they reached their targets. The mere presence of human ships in a system was enough to deter most potential aggressors. The Galactic Council had been reformed, with representation based on population rather than military strength. The humans, despite their dominant position, had insisted on equal representation for all species. They had no interest in ruling the galaxy. They only wanted to protect it. "We are not your masters," Rivers reminded the Council during one particularly heated debate about resource allocation. "We are your guardians. Our job is to ensure that you can govern yourselves freely, without fear of those who would exploit your weakness." The transformation was not without its critics. Some species complained that the humans were too aggressive, too quick to intervene in conflicts that did not directly threaten them. Others argued that the new system was unstable, that it depended too heavily on human goodwill to survive. But the criticism faded as the benefits of the new order became apparent. Trade flourished between species that had never trusted each other before. Scientific advancement accelerated as knowledge was shared freely rather than hoarded. Cultural exchange brought new art, music, and literature to worlds that had been isolated for centuries. The rescue operation that had begun with a single, distress call from Refuge Prime had become the foundation of a new galactic civilization. The humans had not conquered the galaxy, they had liberated it. They had shown that strength used in service of others was more powerful than strength used for domination. The Deathworlders had become the guardians of the galaxy, and under their protection, life flourished as never before. The age of slavery was over. The age of freedom had begun. And it had all started with a simple message sent across the void. Please help us.